Thanks so much for that introduction. It's always difficult to know how to respond when people are so generous. But what I'll do is I'll just say good morning and congratulations for getting up as early as you have, and I hope it will be it'll be worth at least some of your time. I'll share my screen. Right, so the canonical Gospels. We don't have too much time, so I won't wax lyrical, which is what I normally do. I believe so much in foundations that I dig so deep that I never get to the bottom and then can't build the building. So I hope you'll be able to. I hope I'll stop doing that today. But if I can just say by way of introduction, I have been looking at the Gospels for about 15 or so years in some detail. And I'd regard what I do as sort of, if you like, analysis. But now when you look at what you've done, sometimes perhaps it's because of being an older person, you look and you want to sort of synthesize. So I've done quite a bit of analysis now, but the time has come to sort of put it together and say, what does it mean from a top-down point of view? And this is really what we're going to talk about today. So maybe if we start off with the Gospels are there in the New Testament. There are other non-canonical Gospels, if you want to call them that, that were written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. We're not going to talk about those for today. And the question for me is why the New Testament letters are not enough. Well, the letters tell us how to live our faith, how to practice our faith. They tell us a little bit about what we believe about who Jesus is, and so on, and a glimpse into the future that we anticipate. But I think one of the things that's very important in our faith, in Christianity, Jesus's identity matters at least as much as his teaching. So it's not just about these teachings that supposedly come down from God and that we are to practice, but the nature of Jesus himself is a cornerstone of our faith. And that really is only going to be found within the Gospels that we have, which present different dimensions of Jesus's identity. And then maybe the final thing that really struck me once was when we have communion, we always have that wonderful, poignant reminder where Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. And of course, when we have communion, we remember Jesus's death and so on. But Jesus didn't say, remember my death. He said, remember me. And in order to obey such a command, we would need some detail about who he was. So for me, I think the reason that's one very good reason for the Gospels. Then the other question is, why do we need more than one? Well, I just really go by the scriptural principle that a matter must be settled, must have at least 2 or 3 witnesses. So that's what we've got. And then finally, the question about overlaps and how it looks. Why are the overlaps not identical? And there's a lot of discussion on this. I mean, there's been decades and more. But I think there are a few things that perhaps have been missed by some people who've looked at it. Of course, they're heterogeneous impressions of Jesus's identity. Different people see different things as important. They're individual expressions of people's artistic capability. But also there could be different strategic intentions. There could be different purposes. The most important thing, though, that I think really hasn't been explored is understanding how rabbinical teaching works. So when people say Jesus preached, people are thinking of someone standing in a pulpit preaching and then stopping and then going off. Rabbinical preaching isn't like that. So you'd make a statement and then the audience would ask you, what do you mean by that? And so you'd have to say it again in a slightly different way. And then they might ask you again. And you keep doing this interactive question and answer until the rabbi feels that the issue has been settled. So within one sermon, there can be 3, 4, 5, 6 versions of the same truth. So if you're writing what Jesus preached about, obviously you'd be in your right to choose a specific version that Jesus spoke on that day. And I believe that that is one very big missing ingredient in all the studies. Right, let's just get straight into the Gospels then. Let's look at Mark. So this is really just a top-down overview. Unfortunately, to get to the detail, one would have to do lots of comparisons and so on. But this is my conclusion based on the years I've been looking at this. So the Gospel of Mark, as was said last time, is probably the first Gospel written. It's very straightforward. As a narrative, oddly enough, some people, you can obviously organize, you can define narrative in many different ways, but some people actually have 4 different types of narrative, and it's just odd that it fitted for my purposes. But definitely Matthew's a linear gospel. It starts from A and it goes to B, basically in a chronological manner. What's interesting about this, I'm going to use this pattern for all of them. It begins with Jesus being introduced quite obliquely. And we'll see why that is. So, for example, in Mark, the very first verse says, it's the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now, you'd have thought that having begun like that, you'd now tell us about this Jesus, the Son of God. But what actually happens is Mark then goes off and goes on for the next 8 verses or so to talk about John the Baptist, and only then comes back to Jesus in verse 9. And this is almost like the beginning of a hint about Mark. Jesus is the Son of God, but he has to wait in line. And then the ending of Mark is interesting. The ending of Mark, in a sense, there's 2 different versions of the end of Mark. The first one ends at verse 8, which is the most reliable early manuscripts actually stop at verse 8. Although other later manuscripts do add verses 9 to 20. Generally speaking, I'm going to work with the earlier manuscripts, and just note that Mark ends on a cliffhanger. It ends with a fascinating verse. The women go to the tomb. The angels tell them that Jesus is risen. And then verse 8 says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So it ends on this really strange note, which is fascinating because obviously Mark, or whoever wrote this, knew exactly what had happened afterwards. But it's almost like he's saying, I want you to remember what it was like before we knew Jesus had risen. And so the theme here is, despite being the Son of God, Jesus shared fully in our suffering and overcame his own suffering for the benefit of his fellow sufferers. So the idea of the suffering servant is very well understood. The unique contribution of Mark, and I won't do this necessarily for all the Gospels, but I'm fascinated with the way in which Mark 3, verse 20 and 22 goes. It's an incident which is covered in all 3 of the synoptic Gospels, but if you actually compare it, you see how much detail there is here about what Jesus actually endured. It says, then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. So there's this intensity of service, which doesn't even allow them the normal courtesies of life. And then it says, when his family heard this, they went to take charge of him. It's a very aggressive term, that one. It's almost arrest. So, and then it says, for they said he is out of his mind. So his own family was not really understanding what was going on. So he has pressure from them. And then finally in 22, it says, the teachers of the law who had come down from Jerusalem said, he is possessed by Beelzebub, by the prince of demons he is driving out. He is driving out demons. So if you read the others, the incident is there, but Mark is the one who picks out these, what I call microaggressions that many of us experience in our daily lives, but Mark points it out here as something that Jesus experienced as well. My personal description of Mark's gospel is it's very much the downbeat gospel, Jesus undercover. So remember we said how it starts off with this gospel of Jesus, the Son of God. And then it goes on, never a mention about Jesus being the Son of God and just how he experienced life as a human being and a human being who suffered quite a bit, very much in line with what we do, what we experience as well. And then the final thing I'd like to say is the lasting impact. It's a bit strange to say this, but Mark, particularly where it ends in verse 8, is something of a sad story. It's quite melancholic, and it certainly ends in a cliffhanger of unresolved confusion. So as a story, as you read Mark, and I think it was mentioned, Wayne mentioned it last week, that originally the Gospels, or particularly Mark, would have been read at one sitting by the congregation or by somebody. And so if you read it in that way, I think that will come through about the story, what kind of story it is. And perhaps we'll talk about later what type of person this would appeal to. And my guess is if life is difficult, you could recognize that this is your story as well, that you're in this place where things aren't going well, but somehow you have this faith that things are going to turn around. Matthew is very different. Matthew was possibly the next gospel based on the writings of Mark. But what's interesting, although Mark is very linear, Matthew isn't. He's almost, and we'll see why that is. He starts off with this messianic claim, and the first words that you see are a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. And you'll be thinking, what is going on here? What on earth is this all about? And of course, what it is about is that if you look at verse 17, his summary of all that he's said is there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David the king, and 14 from David to Jesus Christ, to the Christ. So apart from the fact that Matthew loves the number 14, which we'll come to later, is this idea that Jesus, by being adopted by Joseph, was part of this messianic line and had a full claim to being Messiah. And the end of Matthew, is one of those quite extraordinary pieces of scripture. The end of Matthew, if you read from verse chapter 28, from 18 to 20, say, it says, Jesus said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." And then he says, "Therefore go and make disciples," and so on. But I mean, this is an extraordinary claim. If somebody said this, normally you would probably want to send them to some place where they look after people who are deluded. But the way in which Matthew has built his gospel is in such a way that as you read it, when you come to that claim, it actually makes you think, you know what? I wonder if this really could be the case. But it does certainly end off with this extraordinary claim. What's fascinating, of course, about this claim is it introduces this concept of authority or power. And we know the statement, power corrupts, or power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So once somebody makes that claim, then you start thinking, goodness me, is it really possible? How do we avoid this person becoming absolutely corrupt? Can we really entrust such a person with all power? And I think that's also what Matthew's about. And the theme of Matthew, in my view, is it's really about Jesus transforming life at every level. We see Jesus the teacher, and that's been explored a lot. There was a whole stack of work done saying that Matthew was built around 5 teachings, 5 major treatises. I believe that those are there, but I actually don't believe that's the central structure of Matthew. But certainly teaching is one major fact. Healing is a big impact. Within the major treatises, all the sections in between are sort of regarded just as narrative. But in that narrative, we find healing, we find Jesus performing some kind of supernatural signs, and we find something very interesting, which I'd like to explore a bit more, which is Jesus just chatting. There are times when Jesus isn't actually teaching, but he is just talking to people. He's not asking them to do something. He's not pointing out something. He's just responding to their queries. And I think that's important because it shows that Jesus is unlikely to be a sociopath. He's actually engages with people where they live, and he feels their issues. So that's something I think very important in Matthew's gospel. So the way in which I understand Matthew is, if you look at Matthew, and you actually can put it into 12 back-to-back quartets, which cover all 4 of these: healing, teaching, communication or conversation, and signs. I've given an example there, but rather than go into them in detail, we could come back to it so you see it. But that section from Matthew 5:1 to 8:34 has the Sermon on the Mount from 5 and 7. It has a whole stack of healings from verse 1 to 17 of chapter 8. And then in then it goes into a sort of chatting session. And maybe I'll just show you what I mean by that, because it's something I don't think I've really come across this description before. But if you look at Matthew chapter 8 and you read from verse 18, it says, when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. A teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." He's not teaching him anything. He's just talking. He's talking about himself and what it would entail. Another disciple said, "Let me go and bury my father." And Jesus said, "Follow me and let the dead bury their dead." Where a lot of people have talked a whole stack about what Jesus meant. But my view is that Jesus was saying, if you need to do that, then you can't wait for your father to die before you come to me. Come to me now. So anyway, just as an example. And then I describe this as a very upbeat gospel. It's almost as if Matthew, having seen Mark's downbeat gospel ending at verse 8 in this, and thought, sure, this is Jesus is more than that. And so you see Matthew then bringing another dimension to who Jesus was. And he paints Jesus as the bearer of these credentials that then back this final claim that he makes at the end of the gospel. And the lasting impact that a reader will have of the gospel, or at least that I have, is it ends on this high note of victorious purpose. So Jesus says, "All power belongs to me, therefore go and make disciples of all nations." It's like this thing saying, it's up to you now. I'm handing it over to you. But by the way, I'm actually still with you. The second last one is the Gospel of John. Gospel of John, I believe, I could genuinely say the narrative type is a viewpoint. If you look at John chapter 20, verse 31, the writer actually tells you why he's written this work, and that will obviously infuse everything that he says. He says, "But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you may have life in his name." So he has a little bit of a quest of his own, but he himself has a point of view that he then pushes throughout the gospel. So he's bringing now another slant. And John, if you remember, wrote his gospels after the others, and the others are called the synoptic gospels because they follow virtually the same structure as each other. But it's like John was like saying, you know, you guys have done okay, but there are some things that you've missed about Jesus, and in particular Jesus's ministry in Judea and in Jerusalem is hardly talked about in the other gospels, and Jesus's relationships and the kind of comments and claims that came out of his relationships form the content of John. The beginning of the Gospel of John is regarded as one of the most powerful pieces of writing anywhere in any era. But I obviously won't read it, but it talks about the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, who was with God in the beginning, etc. And then later in verse 14, it says, the Word became flesh, became a human being, and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So the claim here is, he starts off with this amazing claim about this pre-existent Son of God who's conquered the darkness. And it ends off in a very interesting, very personal way. You'll remember that the Gospels are full of in fact, the Gospel of John, half of it is about the last week of Jesus's ministry, the last week of Jesus's life. Half of it is just it covers a week's worth. So it's a very important part of the gospel. But what's interesting at the end and in that is that it shows the disciples falling away in a way. And we know that Peter denied Jesus vehemently just before Jesus was crucified, and obviously felt bad about it. But this particular passage is when Jesus restores his relationship with Peter. And it's really symbolic of Jesus's constant offer to anybody for a brand new start that's always available at any time. And the theme of John is really Jesus interacting with individuals, homogeneous groups, but at a deeply personal level. And the contribution that John makes, the unique contribution, is these cameos of Jesus's meetings. So, for example, we see Jesus meeting Nicodemus at night. We see Jesus meeting the woman at the well. We see later Jesus meeting with this group called the Jews of Jerusalem, who were a particular sect that was very strict about their adherence to the law. You see Jesus meeting, for example, with Mary and Martha just before the raising of Lazarus. So there are these deep cameos where Jesus crafts a message that is specific to a specific individual. And my description then of this gospel is it's a very personal gospel, almost like Jesus one-on-one is possibly what I would call it. And the impact is, it's a very intimate gospel, an intimate story, and it ends with this promise of personal enlightenment, this idea that by knowing who Jesus is, somehow there's a link to really discovering what true life is. And then the Gospel of Luke I've left to last. I believe it is a quest narrative. First of all, it starts off, if you look at Luke, it starts off almost with a quest for why it exists at all. It's this person who wanted everything to be put in order. But the quest, I believe, is Jesus had a specific quest, which we'll come to just now. And you see it very much in this book. So the beginning, this is a little bit small, so I'm sorry if those who have small screens or looking at it on their cell phones. But I thought I'll put it all here. But it basically locates Jesus's story within God's story. of this war between good and evil, and of the redemption of the human race. So if you read the beginning of Luke, actually, it doesn't even mention Jesus until like verse 26 or so, 27. All the rest is about the high priesthood of the Jews and the way in which God was interacting with them as part of this plan. And we'll see that through Jesus, then this plan is taken from a tribe and it's taken global. So the ending of Luke is interesting as well, because in a way, it's not really the end. Luke actually wrote 2 works. We don't call the second one a gospel because Jesus had already risen and returned to heaven by then, but it's the book of Acts. But it is a continuation of the book of Luke. But at the end of Luke, Jesus bequeaths his quest and his power to his disciples. And we know all about that. Maybe if I read those few verses, just to remind us of how it was. It says here that he told them, "This is what is written, the Christ will suffer and rise from the dead, and on the third day, and repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. I'm going to send you what my Father has promised, but stay in the city until you've been clothed with power from on high." So 2 things bequeathed, his quest and his power. And the theme, of course, I've written it in this way because Luke is quite interesting because it has this sort of story within a story thing, which we'll come to later. But empowered by the Holy Spirit, Jesus was the fuse that ignited God's carefully prepared cosmic intervention to basically make this whole salvation accessible, regardless of self-identity, economic or socio-religious background. And the unique contribution of Luke, in my view, is that Luke is quite interesting in introducing a paradigm that genuinely celebrates diversity. This move of God's story from a tribal, parochial story involving one particular group of people and expanding it to a universal gospel, if you like. And maybe I should just pause here to read a little bit about what I mean about Luke's, the way in which Luke embraces diversity in his gospel. So, for example, in Luke 8, from 1 to 3, it says, Jesus traveled around from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and disease. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household. Note, Herod was the king. This is Herod's chief of staff, and this is his wife. The manager of Susanna. They don't say much more about Susanna, but she's obviously well known. And many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own financial means. What's surprising here is that the whole thing about disciples and their rabbi, they were all men. A man would take a few young men, maybe these guys were between 15 and 20 or so in age, the disciples, and he would teach them. And this is quite extraordinary to have women involved in this whole process. So already people would have been reading this and thinking, goodness me, what kind of a gospel is this? And then if you go to Luke 10, verse 25 to 42, I won't read it all. This is Jesus talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we all know very well. But perhaps in reading the story, which has so much to teach us, we miss the fact that Jesus used a despised Samaritan. Samaritans really were regarded as unclean by the Jews. They had a sort of syncretic religion, their own religion, which was based on Judaism, but it was their own religion. And Jesus actually used somebody from that group of people as his role model in his teaching, which is something very unusual, again. And then the other one was also Jesus in the house of Martha and Mary later on, immediately after that. Once again, Jesus spends quite a bit of time in this household, which is interesting in that it's not headed by a man, but it's headed by a woman, Martha. And there's the only man in sight is this Lazarus, who is probably a younger person. So Jesus spent a lot of time in this rather modern sort of single parent family, or whatever it was. There are no children here. They're just people who live together. We don't know if there were children, but it's clear that it's a very interesting type of arrangement. So Luke delights in bringing this kind of difference into his gospel, and to say, look, nobody's excluded. Everyone can play. And then the description that I'd like to leave is that it's a communal gospel. So where John was very specific, and it's about me and my need for enlightenment, Luke's gospel is rather subversive. Jesus introduces a counterculture, as we've already seen by these small examples. And then the lasting impact is of a panoramic, like global, macroscopic story. But Luke's gospel pauses at the edge of this divinely inspired societal transformation, and then continues into Acts. And Acts is sort of like, you know that we're on the edge of that amazing thing at the end of Luke? Well, this is actually what happened, what continued to happen. And Acts itself doesn't even stop. It sort of is also just, it peters away, because what it's saying is that Jesus has bequeathed his quest and his power to his disciples, and it's over to them to introduce this subversive counterculture into the world. So I think last time there was a lot of talk from Wayne about the whole thing of narrative and stories. So I thought I'd maybe bring it round to, all this is great, but, what does that mean for us? And I thought maybe I could bring this to a head, and then maybe we could have a discussion. But I thought I should say this. It's obvious. Good stories have ups and downs. They have twists and turns. There are uplifting breakthroughs, soul-crushing reversals. There are wow moments followed by the pits of despair. There's times of crystal clarity, the aha moments. But then they're mixed in with depressing times of gray confusion and doubt. This is life. The other thing is, the best stories always include cliffhangers. There's this time where you don't know, will the hero or will the person you're following make it out of this situation? And obviously, if you're sitting there reading this, it's wonderful stuff. The heart is racing and you're wondering, can you put this book down? Can you get it? Is the tea burning? But I think that the interesting thing, though, is first of all, that 99.9% of any story is the middle. It's not the beginning and the end. And I think this is relevant because if the end were, you can't really plot the end from wherever you are. Now, the question is, what does this mean to us? So if we are, in fact, in the middle of the greatest story of all, according to Luke, the story in which God is trying to restore humanity to the place that from which he fell, if you want to call it that, we must expect all of these things. It's great to read about it, but if we look at our own lives, we sit there with twists and reversals and ups and downs. And I think that one of the ways in which we could try to make sense of these is to regard ourselves as being within a story. And so I've got these questions then. First of all, what questions maybe people want to talk about what I've just said. But also I've got some things that perhaps we can start thinking about ourselves. How do we recognize his story in the ups and downs of our own stories? Because if our story is all there is, we're sitting inside the story, and you can never see the end from inside the story. But how do we get to a point where we feel, or we have the sense that we're in the middle of a greater story? And then the second question, perhaps, that I'd like to leave with you is how do we make sense of our story? First of all, how do we recognize the story, but how do we make sense of our own story within that? And I think that the faith that has come down to us is one where, as human beings, we retain our humanity, we retain our individuality, we retain our identity, but at the same time, we have this wonderful relationship with the one who makes sense of it all. We do not get subsumed and vanish into and become almost meaningless within this greater unknown. We retain ourselves, but we live in a wonderful relationship. But how do we make sense of that? And then finally, the question I'd like to pose to us all is, how do we draw others into a recognition of how his story frames, enhances, and makes sense of their own stories? Because in the world, there are some terrible experiences. People experience the most horrendous stories. And somehow we are challenged to bring God's story to these people, but also to make them recognize his story within their own story. So those are the questions I'm posing to you. But if anyone wants to ask me questions, you're welcome to do so. And I'll stop, and hopefully people might want to respond. Thank you.
All right, so Themba, this question came up at the end of last week's, and you ended it this week to underscore the question I have, and that is how to draw others into a recognition of how the story frames our story. My question is, how come have evangelicals viewed the salvation outline as the ABCs: admit, believe, confess, which is very sort of, to me, without a framework, when really we should be doing what your last point said, draw others into the story. So how have we as evangelicals ended up with this like 3 points versus the narrative?
Yes, I think as evangelicals, my view is I think our model of salvation was sort of taken from, I think of the Ten Commandments. Think of the Ten Commandments. So you've got the slave nation, which has been living in slavery in Egypt. They probably worship idols. They've been subsumed into the culture. And they're taken out of that situation. And God has to reform them as a nation. And one of the things that he does is he introduces them to the Ten Commandments, which are, in fact, are a compilation of many of the things that most of Middle Eastern, Near Eastern people believed in anyway. But the idea that he was their God and then all of the rest was to follow. So the idea is that you have these 10 commandments. So we came to the world sort of like Moses. You know, you guys are in a mess. This is what God says. And I don't think that's the model. The model, I think, has to start earlier than the 10 commandments. And it starts in the Garden of Eden, where the Bible tells us that God created humans to carry his image. They actually are made in God's image. So that's the starting point. So you can lose something of that, but we have to start where people are, because that's actually, God is actually in there somewhere. So God came to us. And I think we as evangelicals have always felt that people must come to us. And that is a very fundamental difference between the two. So if we aren't reaching people, it's because we haven't done enough to come to where people are. For Jesus, he stripped his whole, what he was. He basically became human. He became part of us. But then he had one thing that he did all the time to keep his lifeline with who he was. Luke talks a lot about Jesus in prayer. So he went native in the sense of being like us, but he didn't just stay there. He still kept his lifeline to his Father. And that's the tension between the two. We can become so much like everyone else that we've got nothing to offer, or we can be so otherworldly that people just look at us and wonder what we're about. And I think that's possibly part of the answer.
Themba, just wanted to draw you to a question by Pepe on the chat. Thank you, Themba. Really learned a lot. I've been taught to ask this question when reading and interpreting the Bible in order to get to the context. Who said what to whom? Is there a reason that you haven't mentioned who the audience was for each gospel?
Yes, it's very interesting. I think that there has been a lot of work about, people saying Matthew was written to the Jews and all that. I actually don't necessarily go with that. I think that people wrote to express the Jesus they knew. And I think that the Gospels were written to the church. So they're written to the church for them to remember Jesus. Remember, Jesus said, as often as you eat and drink this bread, do this in remembrance of me. They already had the letters. They knew what it was to be a Christian. They knew about Christian behavior, etc., etc. But nobody had said who this Jesus was. So as the time went by, there were fewer and fewer people who had actually met with Jesus. There were fewer and fewer eyewitnesses. So to me, the apostles sat and said, you know what, we know who Jesus was, but the people who are coming to faith now haven't got a cooking clue about who we're really talking about. So for me, it's the first generation of writers. I didn't want to go into this because I think you did a lot of that. These Gospels are all written in the first century. They're written at a time when all the eyewitnesses, many eyewitnesses will have been alive to be able to contradict them and say, no, that didn't happen or whatever. Whereas a lot of the later writings in the second and third century, nobody was there to contradict them or anything like that. So they're written by witnesses, eyewitnesses, or the people who are very close to them within the first century, and they're written to talk to the church and say, this is who Jesus was. But each of them have a very different picture of who Jesus was, and that's what we've got today. So although you might say that Matthew might appeal to the Jews, or John might appeal to baby boomers, and maybe Luke appeals to millennials, we can't really say that's who it's written for. I think it's written for the church, and it's written for people of different types. So some people will be struck by John. Some people will be blown away by Luke. Others will find Mark's melancholy, Jesus, one of us, Jesus suffering, the gospel. So I rather think if apart from being written to the church, the Gospels may be written to different personality types. So that's really my view.
I wonder if Pepe is also alluding to more an internal question. Who said what to whom? Yeah. So is there an internal question that you often, look at,
yes.
Just in terms of those internal groups, the Pharisees and
yes. Absolutely. I mean, I think that that's actually very important. Particularly when we read the Bible, exactly as Pepe said, we sometimes apply the Bible in a really weird sort of way. You know, something is said in somewhere, then we say, this is what we must do. And yet other things that are said, we say, no, that's not applies to us. You know, so I agree with you that context is important. So it's interesting that you point that out. Let me give you one simple example of that. Jesus is asked a very interesting question. I think I probably will get lost. But this question is asked, what should I do to gain eternal life? That question is asked twice in Luke. The first by a lawyer. And that's where Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. The second time it's by a rich young man. And that's where Jesus says, give away all your wealth and follow me. So you're absolutely right that context is very, very important. And not just that. One of the things I've discovered in writing is try to draw in the Jewish context. And the Jewish context here is about the Jewish readings. So basically there's a liturgy which reads through all the books of the Bible, well, all the 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, together with selected writings from on each Sabbath. So each week culminates in a reading of a particular passage in the Torah, together with some associated passage in the writings. And it's obvious sometimes that Jesus is drawing from this when he speaks to people. I mean, for example, Nicodemus. When Jesus speaks to Nicodemus, we as evangelicals love this one because he talks about being born again. And we forget that when he talked about being born again, in the Passover week, there are days where you're supposed to, there are holidays. You're not supposed to work the first day and the last day. But in between, there are these days where you can work. Now, during those days, one of the readings is from Ezekiel 37. And Ezekiel 37 is the valley of dry bones, where the prophet prophesies over these bones and they come to life. They're reborn. It's about Israel being reborn. So when Jesus talks to Nicodemus, he's saying, but we are in Passover season, and you've probably been teaching this thing about the nation of Israel being born again. You know, we need to. So it's about the nation of Israel coming to life under the power of God's word. So I agree with you fully that understanding the context, which is partly the readings of Scripture, sometimes when Jesus says something, you think, oh, you know what? That was the week in which this particular passage was read. So apart from Jesus taking context from the fields of the valleys and the birds of the air, he also takes his context from the readings in the Sabbath that were being read throughout the nation. So context, I agree with you fully. And it's very, very important that we go back to that.
Yeah, you don't have a copy of even just your first book on your desk or behind you there?
Yes, I do. Well, I've got this. There's this one.
Kingdom Awakens, yeah.
And then the next one is this one, The Promise of New Life. And this one, maybe people haven't seen because it sort of was published undercover almost. The Lonely Road. And then there's a fourth one, which I've just finished but haven't yet processed, which I'll call The Light of the World. And then we're into Jesus's last week. So yeah, that'll be my last book on the analysis side.
Good morning, and thank you for an interesting and very challenging presentation this morning. And as I was listening, I kept coming back to thinking about what are the preaching implications for the church, in terms of the Gospels, because so often we read the Gospels and we become over familiar, and there's always this desire to say something new. And so how do, especially with locating ourselves in the story, how do we retell this same old story in such a way that we are able, as you asked the question, how do we bring people into a space of recognition? I don't know how to phrase the question exactly, but it's about how to retell the same old story for clergy, especially for priests and pastors in the church.
Yes.
To avoid looking for something new, but to just retell the same old story in such a way that it sinks in and it becomes almost a second nature in terms of who we are as people.
I think one of the big challenges is maybe going back to the whole thing about human beings being made in the image of God. It's once again, sometimes we're trying to reach out for something outside to bring into. And I think more and more we should recognize that God is already at work in somebody's life. And we actually to find that area of commonality between what we believe and where they are. So the challenge is not so much thinking, oh, which verse should I bring in now? But rather, where is this person? Where is God at work in this person's life? And where can I cooperate with God in where that person is? So it's a much deeper challenge, and it's one that we would say relies much more perhaps on God's inspiration and the power of the Holy Spirit to lead us to where people are. It's all too easy to have a prepared address and to have prepared notes and to know the gospel in that sense. But Jesus never did that. I mean, look at the woman at the well. Jesus talked to her about the well. He didn't say something like, are you born again? Or he talked about the well and drinking water because that's where they were. And I think that's the challenge for us. We need to find out where people are and start there. And that actually is quite a challenge because it means a lot of work on our behalf and a lot of awareness. So we're listening out not only to God, but we're listening out to the people. We're hearing them out. So yeah, it is a challenge, and it has a big implication on preaching, because preaching now no longer is this body of information that I'm bringing to people. It's much more, how can I cooperate with God in this person's life?
I was going to stir a bit and ask, so what's the gospel for COVID?
That's an excellent question. I've thought about this because the COVID experience is almost global. It's basically global. And so we remember that Jesus was able to touch his generation because he touched them where they were. Now, I agree with it. If we can't reach out to where people are in COVID, whether it's to do with actual healing, or whether it's to do with mental healing, or whether it's to do with all sorts that we've all experienced in common. So I think your question is really on point as to saying this actually is almost a global experience. How can we reach people where they are? Because all of us have been affected by COVID in many, many ways, mentally, physically, emotionally, socially. It's been a big, big, big thing. And if our gospel can't reach and make and give some sense of the story, that this is only part of the story, then I think we're missing out. And I haven't got the answer. I really don't. But I am thinking about it.
The idea of, you use phrases like subversive, countercultural, and then out of the Lucan context, inclusivity. But yeah, that idea that as we drive by the buildings of churches, large and small, which are closed and shuttered up until this week again, when this partial reopening allowed is, so where are we, the people of God, and what does the gospel look like in COVID, on mission, in our world? And that's, that's some takeouts that I'm going to wrestle with here going forward, I think, from this.
Thanks. You've actually said something which sparked something in me, Fred. Thank you. When the question about COVID, I really get the sense that COVID is this terrible experience, but by its very nature, we sort of can't share it. We can't talk about it. We've had people who've died and we haven't been able to bury them. We've had people who've died in hospital without us holding their hands. So I'm thinking that maybe one of the things that will come out of this is for us to cry out to God for an awareness of how to be with people after COVID. There'll be lots of people with so much going on inside. And there the question is not for us to tell them this, that, or the other, but just to listen to them. So I think that's a start. So it's almost anyone. You could probably approach absolutely anyone and say, how was your COVID experience? And just hear them out and see where that takes you. So thank you for that, Fred. There's definitely an inspiration in what you said. It just leapt at me right then.